How to enjoy successful gardening. That must certainly be the desire of millions of gardeners everywhere. Those who cultivate maybe an acre or more, down to the enthusiasts who possess but a couple of window boxes. Surely everybody loves beauty in one form or another. It may be music, painting, poetry, or the opposite sex. But where can a more gracious setting for natural beauty be found than in a well laid out and carefully tended garden? You may be told that successful gardening means hard work. But from long experience, we know that nothing returns more pleasure and profit for your labor. We therefore offer you in this record the help and advice of 7 well-known writers and experts, all of whom are practical gardeners. Here is one of the great authorities on garden design and cultivation, Fred Loades.
Any fool can make work. That's a slogan I've believed in over the years, and it applies particularly to garden design. Almost everybody thinks they can design a garden, and of course nearly everybody could. But somehow or another, many amateur garden designers seem to go off at half-cock, and the finished article usually falls far short of what's desired. Now, I think the hardest garden to design is a small one, especially where it is no more than a plot of land partitioned off at the back or the front of the house. 9 times out of 10, the first desire is for privacy, which often means high walls, hedges or screens, and this shuts off light and air movement, and may even create wind eddies and a drafty garden. As many gardens have to be a compromise might start here, in that part should be screened and sheltered, leaving another part open so as not to impede air circulation. The environment and also the needs of the family must also be taken into consideration. The approach to a garden in the country with fields all around it will be entirely different from the approach to a garden in suburbia. Some people will like a pretty garden with trimly clipped hedges and formal beds, whilst others need lawn space for kids and dogs to romp about. Some may like and need vegetables and fruit, whilst others prefer lawns and flowers. Certainly, on fine days, most people like to sit out, and in our uncertain climate, a fine day may follow several wet ones, so that the grass is wet and soggy. Therefore, it is advisable to create a paved area near the house onto which chairs and a table can be placed without damaging the lawn or having the discomfort of wet, soggy ground. Water is attractive in a garden, but here again, with small children, it may not be possible when they are young, but thought and provision could be made for the time when the children grow up and are more responsible. Thus, the idea of the garden begins to take shape. A newly married couple can expect children. So provision needs to be made for ramps rather than steps to facilitate the movement of prams and toddle trikes. With the kids comes bags of washing, so provision needs to be made for unobtrusive clothes posts, which, incidentally, can be made quite attractive by encircling with cylinders of plastic netting, up which not only flowers but vegetables such as runner beans may be grown. Much of a woman's time is spent at the kitchen sink, so try and create something pleasant to look at, and also screen off any eyesores which may range from factory chimneys to a ramshackle cycle shed in someone else's garden. This could be done by intercepting the view with suitable trellis or even the planting of trees. And whilst on the subject of trees, unless the garden is a big one, never plant forest trees. They'll get too big if allowed to develop, and if they have to be pruned severely, they will be mutilated. Not only the tops can be a nuisance, but the roots as well. In a closely built-up area, the whole ground is laced with pipes of various kinds, and the roots of trees have a nasty habit of finding their way into the drains, and even under the house, and certainly under the drive or paths, so that at some time you may find yourself faced with a substantial bill for damages. And try not to plant anything which may annoy your neighbors, and may even result in legal action. All this I know sounds very cramping, but even the decision as to whether the hedge is yours or a party hedge may cause inconvenience or trouble later on. Bearing in mind my slogan, don't plant hedges which need a lot of clipping, unless, of course, you want to spend the rest of your life as a slave to the hedge. To keep even a privet hedge in good condition, it needs to be cut at least 3 times a year. And whilst this may be fun at one stage of a life, it can be a confounded nuisance later on. Similarly, the idea of putting the garden down to grass, because it's easy to look after, also contains pitfalls. For grass is not the easiest of things to grow. That too needs cutting, feeding, weeding, trimming, edging, and this applies to flower beds as well, especially if they're cut in the lawn. Do avoid those little fiddling beds with lots of edges which need to be cut, and trivial paths which lead nowhere. Paths should have an object, and are best sited alongside a hedge, so that any clippings will fall onto a firm surface where they can be easily swept up. Now, I know it sounds beautiful to have roses, honeysuckle, clematis, and wisteria round the door, but don't forget that all these things need support, and they too need feeding and pruning. Any fool can make work, remember? And it may be fun to go on creating and adding, but somebody, sometime, has to maintain these creations. So, to amateur garden designers, I'd say, sit down quietly and decide what sort of garden you want, and whether it's to be permanent, or whether to have a nice open garden when the children are young, to be developed into a different type of garden when they grow up. Try to avoid the square of lawn with a narrow bed all the way round, and at the same time avoid cutting up a decent piece of lawn into lots of silly little beds, which require a great deal of maintenance. Very often the front garden allows scope for formality and fussiness, leaving you space at the back to breathe, to play games, to grow fruit and vegetables. I always try to create gardens which present certain aspects and viewpoints to the house, so that when they're viewed from a window or your favorite seat by the fire,